morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our second Project Divert webinar. My name is Nils Duquet, and I'm the director of the Flemish Peace Institute and the project coordinator of Project Divert. Now, Project Divert is a research project funded by the European Union's Internal Security Fund, Police, and it aims to improve our understanding of diversion of firearms from the legal into the illicit legal domain in the EU. With this project, we hope to contribute to the implementation of the 2020-2025 EU Action Plan on Firearms Trafficking that also prioritizes developing a better intelligence picture on illicit firearms trafficking and safeguarding the illicit market by preventing the diversion of firearms, its components, and ammunition. In the past 2 years, the Flemish Peace Institute and Quitterie, with the help of Arquebus Solutions, analyzed firearms diversion by collecting information on such cases of diversion across the EU and by undertaking in-depth studies of the situation in 8 EU member states. In addition, we also collected information on the various policies and initiatives that have been developed to counter firearms diversion. Now, our project focuses on 3 types of firearms diversion: non-regularization, fraud, and theft. And this morning, here today with you, we will focus on firearms theft. And firearms theft is a significant method of diversion. Our analysis, for example, indicates that annually about at least 20,000 firearms are registered as stolen in the EU. We're also very proud to be able to launch our second report of Project Divert today as well, which is called Stealing Precious Steel, Firearms Theft in the European Union. Now, during the course of our project, we regularly exchange information with national law enforcement agencies and other relevant governmental actors about firearms diversion, and we identified together with them various good practices to counter this phenomenon. I would therefore like to thank our law enforcement partners, Guardia Civil, the Belgian Federal Police, and Europol for their very valuable support during this project. And the close interaction between the researchers and the practitioners really paid off. I would therefore also like to thank many of you in our digital audience today, many of you that have contributed to these exchanges of information. Now, during the webinar today, experts from the Belgian Federal Police, NABIS, SEESAC, and the Flemish Peace Institute will present and reflect on the findings of our report on firearms theft, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible with regards to this topic. If you decide to mention this webinar on social media, please use the hashtag Project Divert. Now, please note that our panelists are, of course, also very open to your questions. You can pass them on using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if a question pops up in this Q&A section that you find particularly relevant, don't hesitate to give it a thumbs up. That way, we are informed that you, as an audience, think this is a very valuable question and deserves priority in answering it. Now, let's start this webinar. And first of all, I would like to welcome Quitterie de Labbey from the Flemish Peace Institute. Quitterie, can you please tell us a bit more about the scope and characteristics of firearms theft in the EU?
Good morning. I will start by sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Then I will start. I will talk to you about the findings from Project Divert on firearms theft in the European Union. These findings are based on our report that will be published later today on firearms theft. I will start this presentation by giving you a brief definition of firearms theft, and then go to the scope of firearms theft in the EU before giving you an overview of the different types and characteristics of firearms thefts that we've identified throughout Project Divert, and then briefly touch upon the policies to combat firearms theft in the EU. Our definition of firearms theft is the deliberate act to take and remove firearms from its legal owner. And throughout Project Divert, we've identified several types of thefts. Robberies are thefts during which people are directly removed from their firearms through the use of force or intimidation. And we've also identified another type of theft, which is burglaries, which are thefts during which people enter a building without authorization with the intent to steal firearms. The scope of thefts, previous research has shown that firearms thefts in the EU are an important source of diversion. Project Fire found that firearms thefts are one of the most common supply channels for illicit firearms trafficking. And Project Safety found that firearms theft are a primary source of firearms for the illicit markets in the EU. But it's difficult to assess the exact scope of the problem in the EU because there are several problems. Data on firearms thefts are generally kept in national databases using various recording methods. Second, not all thefts are reported to the police. And third, not all thefts are detected immediately. For example, we've seen a case in which a museum was closed for a long time, and when it reopened, they saw that several firearms were missing. And then the fourth problem is that there is a number of false declarations of thefts, including unintentional and intentional, for example, in a gun shop to get the insurance money. We collected quantitative data on firearms thefts in 20 EU member states, and I'll show you an overview of what we found. Don't be afraid by this big table. I will zoom in the next slide, but I just wanted to show it to you to show that we found different types of data depending on what was available in these 20 EU member states. We found data on the registered theft declarations that can cover several firearms which have been stolen, and we've also collected data on the registered number of firearms stolen. And these figures suggest that at least 20,000 firearms get stolen from legitimate owners in the EU each year. I'll zoom in the table on the next slide. So I've selected the first top countries and also the countries with the lower levels of theft. And you see that there are huge differences in the numbers of firearm thefts. In France, for example, the first line, you see that in 2015, more than 10,000 declarations of firearm thefts were filed. Whereas in Estonia, at the bottom of the table, only 6 declarations of thefts were filed in 2018. Theft is generally not considered the main source of illicit firearms in most EU member states, with some exceptions. In general, alternative sources complement theft as a source of illegal firearms, such as non-regularization or the smuggling of illicit firearms or the conversion of non-lethal firearms. And in most EU member states, we've noticed a decrease in the registered firearm thefts. Now, what factors can explain these differences in the numbers as well as the evolution of firearm thefts? The levels of gun theft are often connected to the overall level of gun possession in a country. The presence of guns presents opportunities for thefts. For example, in Finland, thefts are considered one of the most important sources of diversion, but Finland also has one of the highest levels of guns in Europe, with 32.4 firearms per 100 inhabitants. But there are also other factors, such as the criminal demand for firearms. For example, in the Baltic states, we found that there is a little demand for illicit firearms, and there is also a very little demand for stolen firearms, and that could contribute to explain why firearms theft is a minor phenomenon in these countries. Also, an increasing pressure on the illegal firearm market can create an incentive for criminals to turn to stolen firearms. And finally, the efficiency of safe storage rules can also effectively prevent firearm theft, but I will talk about that in the last slide. Now moving to the characteristics of firearm thefts. It was not possible to retrieve all the cases of thefts that occurred in each member state, so we decided to collect all the cases of thefts that we could find in media sources, but also in interviews in each member state, and we focused on the past decades, but we also kept some older cases where that was relevant. We identified 184 cases of thefts in 26 member states. Our database of cases is not comprehensive or representative, but it still helped us identify certain patterns of thefts. And if you wish to go through our database of cases, it will be publicly available in our report after this webinar. All types of gun owners can be targeted by thieves, but we observed that the actors most often targeted are private individuals. These are generally hunters, sport shooters, collectors whose private residency is burgled by thieves. And this can be explained by the fact that private individuals are the biggest group of firearms owners in the EU, and also by the fact that rules for safe storage are less strict for these actors than for other types of actors that store bigger amounts of firearms. And it's not surprising that firearms stolen from these owners, so private individuals, are often shotguns and hunting rifles, because it corresponds to the most common firearms among civilian owners in the EU. But actors owning larger stockpiles, such as arms businesses or government stockpiles or museums, have also been targeted by thieves, although less frequently. Among the patterns that we identified, one big difference was between thefts in which firearms are specifically targeted and thefts where firearms are not specifically targeted but are taken by thieves as valuable goods. These are very different types of thefts. In non-targeted thefts, victims are generally private individuals. These cases generally involve 1 to 5 firearms, and the thieves may be professionals or non-professionals who steal firearms as part of the loot, but firearms are generally a byproduct and not a priority. And in these cases of non-targeted thefts, generally opportunism and also negligence in the safe storage rules play a role here. Targeted thefts often target larger stockpiles where more dangerous firearms can be potentially stored. For example, government stockpiles, but also manufacturers, arms dealers, or shooting ranges. And potentially a bigger amount of firearms can be stolen than in non-targeted thefts, as well as a wider variety of firearms, for example, semi-automatic or automatic firearms. And because security standards are generally higher in these places than in private homes, thieves often require a better and more sophisticated organization to access the firearms, or they need the cooperation of an insider who can deactivate the security systems. I'll give you a few examples of targeted thefts. One of the types of actors that we identified that can be specifically targeted by firearm thieves are law enforcement stockpiles. This picture shows members of the Special Commando of the police in Germany. In 2019, a police officer from this commando was found guilty of stealing large amounts of ammunition, up to 55,000 rounds, and also some firearms and explosives. And he served as a sharpshooter and trainer of firearms shooting in the Special Commando. The ammunition was passed on to him in his capacity as a trainer for firearms by his colleagues after target shooting training sessions. So this case shows that law enforcement agencies can be targeted by thieves. They can be targeted in different contexts, either during burglaries at police offices, like in this case, or in warehouses, or at home when police officers are allowed to take their service weapons home. But firearms have also been robbed from police officers during police interventions. This case also shows that large quantities of ammunition, but also potentially firearms, can be stolen from this type of actor. And concerning the types of firearms typically stolen, they generally correspond to those in possession among the police, so typically handguns. In this case, also, it's important to note that the perpetrators had intelligence on the storage location of the ammunition. And I'll move to another type of actor. Armed forces are another important type of actors that have been targeted by firearms thieves in the EU. This picture was taken in 2011 when 20 Heckler & Koch rifles and 10 pistols were stolen from a military barrack in Badajoz in Spain. The Guardia Civil arrested 5 suspects who were Spanish citizens. They were connected to organized crime and they were responsible for a range of major robberies in banks. A former member of the military had provided the thieves with detailed information on security measures. We've seen that military stockpiles can be targeted by thieves in different locations, in military bases, warehouses, or vehicles, or also during interventions. This case is typical for cases of theft targeting military stockpiles. In this case, 30 firearms were stolen, including rifles and handguns, and it shows that a wide variety of firearms can be stolen from military stockpiles, including prohibited firearms. And it also shows, this case also shows the role of inside knowledge in these targeted thefts. And finally, a last type of actor that can be specifically targeted by thieves that we have identified is commercial actors, such as firearms dealers or manufacturers, transporting companies or shooting ranges that have been specifically targeted. This picture shows the transporting company Multitra Logistics. In May 2017, several dozen hunting weapons were stolen from this firm in Belgium as a result of improper storage. The weapons had been left in a vehicle in a car park from where they were taken. And as a sanction, the Ministry of Justice refused the company's application for exporting, importing, and transporting weapons and ammunition that same year. This case is exemplary for the importance of safe storage rules to protect commercial businesses from thieves. There are different ways how arms businesses can be targeted. They may be targeted when they are closed or unattended. Thieves can also target warehouses or containers of export and import companies, or even firearms displayed during gun fairs. And the quantity of stolen firearms from firearms dealers generally concern 10 or more firearms. This shows the risk that high amounts of firearms can be taken from this type of actors. The types of firearms that can be stolen from arms businesses can be of any type which is legally sold in a country. So here again, the wide variety of firearms. Regarding the perpetrators of targeted thefts, we identified that inside knowledge is a facilitating factor for firearm thefts, targeting bigger and more secured stockpiles. And the perpetrators are either insiders who commit the thefts themselves or who provide key information on how to deactivate security systems. We've observed both high professionality, for example, using heat-powered cutting devices, to more simple methods such as breaking through the front windows of a shop. And finally, I will just briefly present you some key findings that we found on policies to combat firearm thefts. The theft of firearms, especially those from larger and more dangerous stockpiles, can have far-reaching consequences if they end up in the wrong hands. This is why, in the aftermath of several shootings and terrorist attacks committed in various member states of the EU introduced new measures to fight against illicit firearms trafficking, including new amendments on safe storage to the EU Firearms Directive, but also the EU adopted an action plan 2020-2025 to combat illicit firearms trafficking, including diversions through theft. And finally, we've identified several good practices in different EU member states, such as periodic controls and verification, reducing surplus, etc., etc. My time has run out now, but I'm happy to answer questions, any questions on the policies to combat firearm theft in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Quitterie, for giving us some more insight in the scope and the characteristics of firearms theft. Now, last week, international news bulletins from across the world proved it abundantly that we also have, of course, problems with firearms theft here in Belgium. So I'm very honored to introduce to you Frédéric Quewet from the Belgian Federal Police, the section on arms trafficking. Frédéric, what can you tell us about firearms thefts in Belgium?
Hello, just a moment. Yeah, I guess. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nils, for giving me the opportunity and to explain a little bit and to say a little bit more on the Belgian situation. Actually, it's quite difficult to be to come after Quitterie and this very comprehensive study, because you explained a lot, and I wanted to focus on a few interesting points, mainly the difference between real and fake theft, because in Belgium we had this last year a few difficulties to identify and to know what is the difference between a real theft and a fake theft. Quitterie mentions many different modus operandi about real theft. Now I'm going to explain a little bit more and about what fake theft and how we try to make the difference between fake and real theft. What is the general context of the situation in Belgium? We have a national public safety plan every 5 years. And we try to contribute, of course, because all actors of safety are involved in the National Public Safety Plan. This is a 5-year term, and evaluation has just been released. We call it the picture of criminality, and it has been done by the Department of Strategical Analysts. The next plan is starting in 2022, and we can say, unfortunately, that firearms trafficking will not be a priority in Belgium anymore. In total, the cases of firearms trafficking in 2015, there was a peak with more than 300 cases. But since 2015, these figures remain stable. So we are now, in terms of investigation, between 200 and 240 cases a year. About the situation of lost and stolen firearms. Of course, we speak about legal firearms, legally owned firearms, and our strategical analysts are working on two different databases. The first one is the official database central register, and this register is let's say it's not a judicial database. So the second database is a judicial database, the police database for wanted persons, but also, of course, for the different means of transportation, firearms, and so on. So we have really two different aspects of the police work. On the one side, the more administrative aspect, and on the other side, the judicial aspect. What I'm presenting here is a graphic on the last 3 years, how many firearms have been stolen when they were legally owned. I wanted to show also the difference between the declarations of lost firearms. This is a perspective. You can see here we have more than 7,000 lost firearms in 2018. So quite a lot. In comparison, we had only 639. I think Quitterie was talking about 600 firearms stolen a year. In Belgium, yes, this is a big figure, but this is decreasing. As you can see, the general trend in 2020, we are around 300 stolen firearms. I found it interesting to also give an overview of the type of weapons that have been stolen. And we can see an interesting difference between, so for the last 3 years, still the same period, a very interesting difference between the type of stolen firearms in Belgium. On the one side, what I call long weapons, so rifles and so on. And on the other side, handguns, which is the majority. More than 60% of stolen firearms in Belgium are short weapons. In comparison with lost firearms, we can say this is just the contrary. We have more than 70% of lost firearms that are supposed to be rifles of long weapons. And very few, no, sorry, 27% is not very few, but this is not the majority of handguns. Quite interestingly, we have also noticed a different geographical distribution of the phenomenon. So we have two parts of the country of the average. This is quite historical. So this is possibly related to the local type of criminality, which is quite characteristic in these two parts of the country. In my introduction, I explained that we had some troubles these last 2 or 3 years to make a difference between the real and fake thefts. Why did we had this problem? Because as you can see here on this graphic, this is the evolution for the last 15 years. So the blue line is the declared lost firearms, and the red or orange line at the bottom is the stolen firearms. You can clearly see there are two peaks. Even if 2018 for stolen firearms is slightly lower, but it's still interesting because we had, yes, these two peaks in 2010 and 2018. What was the cause, the origin of the problem? This was the amnesty period during these two years. And you can see in 2019 that there is still a consequence. We are still very high. The same in 2011. In comparison, for stolen firearms, we have exactly the same. And the figures of Quitterie were of course correct, but you can say we are on a normal year, like 2020, around 300 stolen firearms in Belgium. During this amnesty period, we have doubled these even more, these figures. So we really had a trouble, and the political pressure was very high to give an evaluation and of course of the consequences of this amnesty period. So we had to work a lot to try to identify the real theft and the fake theft. So we do not have figures, but we can imagine that if a normal year is around 300, that we had around 300 or 400 cases of firearms reported stolen that are not real theft. The counting methodology is difficult. So I really appreciate the work of the Flemish Peace Institute because they did really a great job. It's really difficult. I know that because we are working with our analysts on these different databases, and sometimes we can observe that the judicial database, which is the database with firearms to be searched, the wanted database, the wanted persons, wanted objects, and so on. And the figures are different with the official, the legally owned firearms in the central register. For instance, we have more stolen firearms in the judicial database, and we have more lost firearms in the central register. So the most important thing that at the end, the trend is the same. So it doesn't make a real difference. So this last years, sorry, the analysts, they tried a new way with a more qualitative analysis. And they tried to detect significant cases. The different observations that have been presented by Quitterie are reported also in a very comprehensive report in 2018 by the Belgian analysts. And we observed, for instance, a theft by opportunity in private houses, but it has been described by Quitterie. In the meanwhile, we have theft with premeditation and or criminal organization involved if we talk about theft with police forces, gunsmiths, army stockpile, and so on. Although this is not a huge majority in Belgium, the legislation, the Belgian legislation is quite strict about the storage. So not everybody puts the guns in the car, just like the example in the Quitterie's presentation. Last year, we had a very interesting analysis, and two persons were involved, and they read more than 1,000 police reports, which is huge. And the results were released a few weeks ago, so I cannot really talk about it. Now, weapons legislation becomes stricter, so the problem of diversion will remain important in the next few years, because the goal of the citizens, they want to keep their weapon, even if they know it became illegal. So the problem of our two amnesty periods, they show us that many thefts were actually false declarations. And I hope that we are going to focus a little bit more in the next few years on the real theft. And we are going to try to reinforce the security measures for a safer storage. And of course, there are some possibilities to think about more control at home, for instance, by the local police, but it is quite difficult. It is just a question of political will. And actually, we observed that there is a very narrow border between non-regularization, theft, fraudulent activities. So it's not easy to make a difference. These are not really three different containers. They are all the same, and it makes sense to have a common approach of those phenomena. That's all for me today. I hope it was interesting, and I give the floor to Nils.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. It was very interesting to see those figures. I can also see that in the Q&A section of our webinar, because there's lots of questions flowing in. Let me start with a question which was specifically more for Quitterie, and it was asked is the following question: do we have any sense of how many unreported crimes there are, for example, of unregistered illicitly held firearms? And then there's a second question also for Quitterie, which is on the collection of the data on firearms thefts. Could you elaborate more on the main discrepancies among EU member states in this regard? To what extent is this problematic, and how can this issue be addressed? So I would like to give you the floor first, Quitterie, and then have some questions for Frédéric.
Thank you, Nils. About the question on unreported crime, it's difficult to estimate how many unregistered firearms are stolen in the EU. It's difficult also to estimate how many firearms are unregistered in the EU. There have been some estimates of unregistered firearms in the EU by Small Arms Survey. They were based on estimates. They were based on a calculation using a ratio, and that was multiplied by the number of registered firearms. But these are difficult to use. What we can do as well is organize phone surveys to ask firearms owners if they have a firearm, and then compare with official data of registered firearms. That was done in a study by the Flemish Peace Institute, focusing on Flemish firearm owners in Belgium. And what I can also say is that in Europe, there is no, to my knowledge, there is no estimate of how many stolen firearms are actually reported, how many thefts of firearms are reported to the police. But there has been a study in Chicago that found that between 75 and 82% of theft are declared to the police. So that gives an idea of how many, potentially how many cases of thefts go unreported, although that can't really be fully applied to the EU because the US is a very different context. And then about the second question about discrepancies in the numbers of firearm thefts among different EU member states. Generally, I think that firearm ownership plays a role. If you remember the table that I showed, France has the highest number of firearm theft in the EU, but it also has one of the highest levels of gun ownership. And in Finland as well, the example I gave shows that yeah, the levels of gun ownership play a role, but it's not always true. We found, for example, that Germany has many registered firearms, but it also has little levels of thefts. So it suggests that there are other factors that play a role. And we've tried in the report to identify several factors that can also influence the levels of theft. We found that a smaller legal firearm scene can also present less opportunities for thieves, like it's a case in the Baltic states. We found as well that alternative sources for illicit firearms can also influence the levels of theft. For example, the use of converted firearms. In Lithuania, we've identified that it's very attractive for criminals more than stolen firearms. But we've also found that yeah, safe storage rules in the EU can play a role, although it's difficult to exactly pinpoint the exact impact of safe storage rules in the EU because of a lack of comprehensive data. What we found is that although the EU Firearms Directive provides rules on safe storage and safe transportation, these rules are not very harmonized in the EU. And we've also identified several good practices, such as using a certified safe or conducting periodic controls of the safe storage at the place of private gun owners, but also larger stockpiles. But here again, it's difficult to measure the exact impact of these rules.
Okay, thank you, Quitterie. We also have some questions specifically for Frédéric. The first question for you, Frédéric, why is firearms trafficking no longer a priority in Belgium? And there's also immediately a second question, which is that there has been a huge decline in lost and stolen firearms in Belgium. Is there a COVID impact here, as burglaries may have decreased and many activities have not taken place as a result of the lockdown? So, Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Yes. So, Nils, for your first question, yes, it's difficult to accept for me, of course, but there is a very complex matrix that has been done by our different analysts for all kinds of criminal activities. So this is not only about firearms, but this is also about criminality against environment, criminality, drugs, human trafficking, and so on. And they analyzed different figures for the last 5 years to observe, yes, the general trend for this phenomenon. So then they propose, of course, to the different political authorities different activities. And the police, we have the federal and the local police in Belgium. So the federal police, which is in charge of this kind of organized crime, proposed to the political authority different action plans and they say, okay, this kind of action is a priority because we observed a very significant increase of cases for the last 5 years, for instance. The problem with firearms, it is like you probably all know, a hidden activity. So if you don't look for this kind of trafficking, you will not find anything, of course. And these last few years in Belgium, there was a huge activity against terrorism, for instance, after the two bombing in 2016. So during 2-3 years, the police activities were focused, when we were talking about organized crime, on terrorism, for instance, which with a huge capacity involved in these investigations. So firearms were coming in a second, on the second place, even third place, and it is not really, how can I say that? Something, if it comes in the newspaper, yes, it is interesting. But most of the time, if you have just 1 or 2 weapons that have been stolen, it's not really interesting. You just have a few lines in a newspaper and it doesn't come on the TV. And but if you arrest the terrorists, yes, it is a very good result for the police. So you have a difference in this kind of things is really important also for our political decision makers, and they like the fact that, okay, the police can show some very nice and interesting results, but it's not really the case with firearms. Yes, if a gunsmith has been stolen, you have a few weapons that have been sold to a motor gang, for instance. Yes, a few lines, a small article in the newspaper. So finally, if you don't look for it, you will never have figures. And this is what happened in Belgium, because we were not really investigating this field anymore at the local level. And so the figures were decreasing. So the impression of the political parties that are now in the government is, oh, okay, it is decreasing. We are on the good way. We are in the correct direction. So we don't have to invest a lot for the next few years. Quite unfortunately, the European Commission is thinking differently. And so we will have a contrast between the European level and the Belgian level. And it will be a very difficult position for our little department in the next few years, actually, yeah. And your second question about the COVID, yes, I think, of course, people were at home. So it was a little bit more difficult. And I have to say, it was not only for firearms, because the department just next to mine is the Department of Organized Theft. So let's say, burglaries and people that are coming from Eastern countries, among other. I'm not focusing on one country, but coming from Eastern countries and organized criminal groups, and they observed exactly the same trend. So not only for firearms, but also for vehicles, for home jacking and home invasions and so on. So there were less activities, of course, during 2020 because of the COVID. But the difficulty is also the timeline of the registration, because we have always some delay between the fact that that the weapon has been stolen on one day, and you have to wait several months before having effectively the registration of these stolen firearms in the official register. So we can not really say at the moment and that there is a consequence of the COVID. We still have to wait a little bit more to see if it is continuing on the same way.
Thank you, Frédéric, for that answer to those questions. There are many questions popping up in the Q&A function. I hope we still have some time for that later. But I would like to move on to the next speaker. And as the previous presentations have demonstrated, preventing and combating firearms theft is quite an important challenge. With us today, we have Ian Head. Welcome to our webinar, Ian. You work at NABIS, the National Ballistic Intelligence Service in the United Kingdom, and I'm very sure that you can tell us much more about the situation in the UK and the challenges and the possibilities that you see for preventing and combating firearms theft. So I would like to give you the floor.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for giving me the floor. Apologies to everybody. I'm unable to control my own presentation this morning through technical problems, but hopefully it will run smoothly and somebody can change it for me. Thank you very much indeed. It is my honour and privilege to speak to you all this morning, and thank you very much for involving me in this project DIVERT. As you can see there, I am the head of intelligence at the National Ballistics Intelligence Service, and if you could change slides, please. Just to give you a brief explanation about what NABIS does. NABIS has been in existence since 2009, and it's an organisation that combines both ballistic and criminal intelligence at the same time to help investigators in investigating gun crime. We also form part of a national firearms focal point. That focal point looks at ballistic intelligence, criminal intelligence, knowledge around firearms, firearms trafficking. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. The next slide. Yes, thank you. We're also involved in firearms tracing of lost and stolen firearms, whether they be lost and stolen in the UK or in fact lost and stolen elsewhere in the world, and we undertake firearms traces for those on behalf of other countries as well. So that's the role of NABIS, just to briefly explain to you what we do around firearms trafficking. And if we could have the next slide, please. I just wanted to basically start off this presentation. If we're looking at the sort of large-scale firearms theft and the ammunition theft, is overall in the UK, there is limited evidence of bulk theft in transit of firearms and ammunition based on specific targeting. But what we do see, however, and what this presentation will concentrate on, is the theft of firearms and ammunition from licensed holders in the UK, from their vehicles, domestic dwellings and their properties, and the movement of that from the lawful to the unlawful. So that's what we'll be concentrating on primarily in this presentation. And if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you very much. From a UK licensing perspective, unlike many other countries in the EU, in order to possess a firearm in the UK for a lawful purpose, an application for a license is made to the relevant police force where that individual lives. Excuse me. The results of that application and any subsequent granting of a certificate are recorded on a national database that we have in the UK for all licensed firearms holders, and that's called the National Firearms Licensing Management System. Therefore, all legally held firearms are therefore recorded throughout their lifespan on this database, the name of the individual and of all the firearms and the ammunition that that individual possesses. That's contained on that database. Also, at the time of granting a license, a prescribed safekeeping condition is attached to all firearm and shotgun certificates, that the guns and the ammunition must be stored securely in a locked gun cabinet or other similar secure cabinet, such as a safe. And when transporting those firearms, the certificate holder must take reasonable precautions to make sure that those firearms and the ammunition is kept safe. And if the vehicle is left unattended, then the advice is to remove certain component parts from that to make the gun inoperable. So that's some of the legislation and the advice and guidance that goes at the time of granting a license. And if we could move to the next slide, please. From a UK perspective, as at the 31st of March of this year, you will see that there were almost 600,000 people in the UK who held a firearm or a shotgun certificate. And of those, nearly all of those licenses were granted for shotguns. And as you can see, those shotguns also covered 1.3 million weapons there for those. So you can see the sorts of numbers of firearms that we have in the UK under license there. And thank you. If you could move to the next slide, please. So in the UK, when a firearm is reported lost or stolen, quite naturally that is reported to the local police. That firearms database, which I mentioned, the National Firearms Licensing Management System, is updated with that information. We at NABIS, the focal point, is also updated as to that loss or theft, and that's included on our databases as well. And we undertake an IARMS search for that, and IARMS is the Interpol database for all lost, stolen and trafficked firearms. And the UK is one of the members of that, and so we place all our lost and stolen firearms on that database. Should that firearm ever be recovered in the UK, we can check it again, or elsewhere in Europe or the rest of the world to see whether that firearm has been used. And if we could have the next slide, please. If we move on the next slide, press again, please, if you wouldn't mind. If we look at in the UK, then obviously once firearms are reported lost or stolen, then unfortunately there is that prospect that it's moved from the lawful to the unlawful. If you could have a press again, please. What we can see that in 2020, so last year, there was a report of 420 firearms being stolen. 356 were shotguns and 64 rifles were reported lost or stolen. And the next slide, please. And out of those, you can see that 104 were reported as lost and 316 were reported as stolen. So if you look at the overall figures of license holders that we have in the UK, sorry, if you could go back, please. No, that's forward, back. That's it. Thank you. Sorry about that. It's as you can see from those figures, and you would have seen what the original figures were. It's not an awful lot that's reported lost or stolen. However, it is a significant threat, quite naturally. And as you can see from that picture there, when our shotguns are stolen, then they are adapted and sawn off and used in multiple crimes across the UK, and that's the real risk when firearms move from the lawful to the unlawful. And if you could move on, please. Thank you. So how do we approach this then from a UK perspective when weapons reported lost or stolen? Well, we do have in place a protocol for the investigation and recording of lost and stolen firearms. The lost and stolen strategy has the aim of setting a consistent national minimum reporting and investigative standard that police forces should adopt. If we look at the location of the theft, we're looking at exactly what was stolen, full details of the weapon, serial number, identifying marks. And we're looking to see if there's any firearms been left at the scene that weren't stolen. We're looking to see whether the offender was whether the licensed holder was a repeat victim as to previous ones as well. We look for closed circuit TV around the local area and local inquiries. And if we have a forensic strategy in place for fingerprints and things like that, and we obtain details of all residents, employees, tradesmen, and anybody who might have had access to that location. And then we look at the victim as well. Where did the victim purchase the ammunition and the firearms? Where does the victim take their weapon to be serviced? Are they members of gun clubs, memberships, association to clubs? And where does the victim shoot? And where did the last victim go shooting? And where was that? So we look at all these sort of things to try and do our utmost to understand how the weapon or the ammunition was stolen, to identify suspects, and then if they are, obviously quite naturally, to carry out investigations to apprehend the offender and to recover the firearms. So next slide, please. One other thing that we do, and we strongly recommend to license holders as well, it's called the Voluntary Cartridge Retention Scheme. For our shotgun holders, we advise that they take a test fire of that shotgun cartridge, keep it safe, and keep it away from the actual firearm itself, and not in the gun cabinet, so it doesn't get stolen as well. But should their firearm ever be reported lost or stolen, subject of a burglary or a theft, then we would ask that license holder then to submit that cartridge case through the police, the local police. That would eventually come to NABIS. We could then update that, upload that cartridge case onto our automated ballistic identification system, which we actually use the IBIS system. And once it's on there, then should that weapon ever be recovered, or ever hopefully or used in a crime, then hopefully we will be able to match that with the records on our database to see A, whether it's been recovered, or B, it's being used in crime and where, and we can look to see whether we can recover that weapon. So that is something that we have in place at the moment. It's an entirely voluntary one. I can say we have had some success with that, and so it is certainly something that we encourage our license holders to do. If we could move to the next slide, please. And then we've got what the license holders' approach to this should be. And I think, and it's been covered in previous ones as well, absolutely ensure that the firearm is secured properly, as it should be in gun cabinets. Don't have that complacency of not securing your firearm once you've used it. It's absolutely imperative that it is secured and fixed in the cabinet. That said, we have had targeted burglaries where the gun cabinet has been forced open, or it has been ripped from the wall and taken away by the offenders, and it's been found just literally around the corner from where the people live with the items in there. Again, one of the things that we're strongly sort of advising is the avoidance of social media and advertising, and I'll put that into the context is that try to avoid social media for the advertising of shooting events, locations and photographs on social media to prevent license holders becoming victims of crime. It's really important that we try and avoid that, because criminals will use such forms of media to identify licensed holders, their addresses and locations, their vehicles, their habits as well around that. And, you know, and to ensure that clear examples as well around it of people being followed from shoots and from things like that. And excuse me, my screen has just frozen, just forgive me. Thank you. So yeah, it's really important from that aspect to not advertise where you live and the fact that you might be having firearms and ammunition in your home. And if we could move to the final slide, please. As I've said before, as you can see, not many firearms are stolen in the UK, thankfully, although only a small percentage are, and they do move from the lawful to unlawful. considerable harm can be caused to the public in terms of damage, injury, and fatalities. And shotguns are responsible for a large percentage of criminal use in the firearms, and we've got that from our statistics. So it doesn't need very many to be stolen for serious offences to be committed. And if we could move on to the last slide, please. And this is just the last part I wanted to say. I believe that every effort should be made to secure those firearms, to ensure that they remain in lawful possession. And that's something that we really must encourage our licence holders to do to prevent that. And thank you very much. If you can just move on. And that is the end of my presentation, Nils. Sorry, I've not been able to control my own screen, but it went as well as we could. Thank you.
No, thank you, Ian. Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I think the audience was able to see everything, so we're happy that we could share your slides. Let's move on to the next speaker, Alain Lapon. He's Chief Technical Advisor at SEESAC. Alain, you have very broad experience on firearms control issues in the Western Balkans, and we would like to hear from you if you can share some of the lessons learned from that region also for the EU. I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Niels. Can you hear me and see my slides?
We can hear you fine and see the slides, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So as said, first of all, I would like to thank you for having us on board. I'm Alain Lapon, Chief Technical Advisor of SEESAC, Southeast European and Small Arms Clearinghouse for Small Arms and Light Weapons, Southeast and Eastern Europe Clearinghouse for Small Arms and Light Weapons. And I talk a little bit on firearms theft in the Western Balkans and lessons learned. So first of all, I think the Western Balkans have been known for theft through looting, but we have seen looting from Albania during the several conflicts. Approximately 560,000 weapons were looted from Albanian stockpiles, although 220 to 230,000 were then immediately recovered. And then we have also a number of weapons which were looted from territorial defense, which are now in illegal possession by civilians. So in the light of that, so SEESAC actually support also the jurisdiction in implementing small arms control strategies, which the main function area is collection, recovery through voluntary surrender, and then also confiscation of these weapons. I will not talk very much further on this item, but I will go actually to the situation now. And so, as you know, SEESAC is also supporting the implementation of the roadmap, and based on the roadmap, jurisdictions providing key performance indicators. And here you see data from key performance indicator reports. So 2018-19 and the first quarter of 2020, you see the number of weapons stolen by jurisdiction. So the number of weapons stolen by jurisdiction, and you see in this period that about 1,303 weapons were reported lost and stolen. We have also seen theft from registered firearms dealers and jurisdiction or state weapon storages. So for example, we had 2 cases from registered firearms dealers in North Macedonia. And part of the stolen weapons were then later seized in Skopje and another part in Pristina. We have then lately also had one case in Kosovo and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Threats, well, we see from individuals, we see an increased burglaries, but also armed robberies, which actually for us, it could have 2 effects. So it decreases actually the trust in the police, and could actually create a new demand for weapons for what we say personal protection or self-protection. Further lessons learned in this regard, well, in the Western Balkans, there is a legal framework in place in every jurisdiction on weapons, and it dictates that every lost and stolen weapon must be reported to competent authorities, and competent authorities will start an investigation in this regard, a little bit similar to what Ian has presented. So also the investigation includes uploading data into Firearms for tracing purposes. Western Balkan jurisdictions started a database on lost and stolen as a model of their weapon registration systems, because in all Western Balkan jurisdictions, weapons or has to be licensed or get an authorization as the Balkan jurisdictions are trying to harmonize their legislation with the European Firearms Directive. Laws provide actually requirements of safekeeping, and so it means preventing access to unauthorized persons to that weapons. So there are different criteria in place according to the number of weapons kept. So by natural persons, by legal entities, by collectors, and by jurisdictional state institutions. So this means the more weapons they have, the more security procedures are in place. For example, it starts from a safe at home to weapon rooms and storages protection for legal entities. Some jurisdictions are also test firing some of the legal weapons. So every weapon which is legally owned is test fired, and quite maybe similar to the cartridge retention scheme in UK. So these weapons are test fired and then put into IBIS. So to make sure if a weapon gets stolen, that it's known from which weapon the bullet recovered was from. Then there are also specific issues for physical security and stockpile management. And physical security and stockpile management is actually in transition in the Western Balkans, as because based on, for example, for jurisdictions, based on the surplus calculation, and then we dealing with prospective sites versus non-protective sites. So it means that actually the storage sites in the Western Balkans are reducing, and sometimes they use transit sites to bring it from one location to another. Some level of protection, but most of it is protected according to the international technical guidance LICS level 1, because risk level 2 and 3 could create a higher cost. So it depends on actually an assessment, what is stored in that storage, and PSSM is also based on delaying and denying authorized access to the most wanted item. In this storage by putting up barriers such as open space, fences, lights, CCTVs, personal intruder detection systems, electronic locks, metal doors, etc. So the full range of PSSM is used for state institutions, and some of these elements are also applied to legal dealers or producers. Standards used by civilians and by different jurisdictions, or actually the international ammunition technical guidelines and the mosaic before the small arms control standards, and they linked to laws. And then for state jurisdictions, also the NATO standard AAPT1 and AAPT2 are used and actually described in standard operation procedures. Regarding investigation, so every lost and stolen as before is subject to an investigation to prevent that the accident happens again, and that weapon can be used in several, try to prevent that this weapon can be used in several incidents. So the scenario, there is an initial constatation of a lost or stolen weapon, and small arms control initial report is then actually developed. As the result of the investigation, there is also a small arms like weapons control, a detailed report developed. Threats, there is very often looked at external and internal threat, because it could be that some people who were working in the storage or involved in actually diverting weapons, or if we talk on legal dealers or producers, or even on jurisdiction level. So this is evaluated. Then also threat and risk assessments are actually implemented biannually. And the trends for desired items, besides the automatic rifles, which are legitimate weapons from wars, we see that there is a trend that there are some targeted burglaries regarding pistols. Then also, I think the hand grenades and pyrotechnics could be a desired item, because hand grenades are popping up in the European market. So we have some incidents, for example, from Sweden, looking at that. And then also pyrotechnics category 4, which are the bangers, which could be stolen from legal dealers. Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alain, for these very interesting lessons learned. And I think we can also say that we have found similar lessons learned also in our study of the EU. But very good to have this overview, because I think it also touches upon some of the questions that popped up in our Q&A about possibilities and problems within legal frameworks and policy actions. There were also a couple of questions specifically on motivations for theft, and including terrorist purposes, which is something that I would like to also address in my presentation. And then afterwards, we will go back to the Q&A for the final questions. I'm going to try to share my screen with all of you. So in this final presentation, I would also like to zoom in a little bit on the issue of gun violence with stolen firearms, because this is, of course, the reason why we have been doing this study, is also to try to prevent violence that takes place with stolen firearms. And this is something that's of course very relevant today. As many of you know, there is currently a manhunt ongoing here in Belgium for a soldier with right-wing extremist views who went to his army barracks about a week ago, took 4 light anti-tank weapons, a P90 submachine gun, and a 5.7 pistol, and disappeared after he left a suicide farewell note stating that he would like to die, but before he would do that, he would try to take his revenge on the system and the virologists. So this is something that really shows you that this person still had access, despite the fact that he was known for his right-wing extremist views, and he was actually signaled on a terror list here in Belgium for many months before that, which really shows you that there is still a problem also in our country with the protection of our military stockpiles. It also shows you the potential that it can have for gun violence as well. What we would like to do is tell you what the intelligence picture is that we have on gun violence with stolen firearms. And I would like to reiterate what was being said earlier by Ian, by Alain, but also by Frédéric, is the importance of investigating these kinds of issues, the importance of reporting thefts, actually tracing firearms, doing ballistic analysis. All of these issues are crucial if you want to not only solve the theft of the firearm in itself, but also if you want to create a strategic intelligence picture on this topic. And I think this is something where a lot more work can actually be done in the coming years. We've also looked at some of the previous studies on this topic, on firearms thefts and linkages with criminality, and they actually show some mixed results. On the one hand, you have some studies from the United States, from New Zealand, which actually indicate that there is actually quite a high risk of criminal use of stolen firearms. On the other hand, we've also seen studies in Sweden, for example, which actually state that the stolen firearms hardly ever pop up in murder cases, robberies, and those kinds of criminal activities. So the mixed results is something that we have to take into account. There is sometimes also the issue that it's being said that the firearms that are stolen are not always the weapon of choice of criminals. And this is something that has to do with what Quitterie has been mentioning earlier today, that very often the type of firearms stolen are a reflection of the legal possession in a country. And in many countries, this is shotguns and hunting rifles, which are not always the primary choice of a criminal when they want to have a firearm. What have we done? Quitterie mentioned the database that was developed as part of this project. It also includes various incidents with gun violence with stolen firearms, and I would like to just go over some of the key findings with you today. One of the conclusion that we have is, although we don't have a clear idea of the scope yet of criminal use with stolen firearms, it is clear from the incidents that we have collected data on that they can have very significant security consequences for societies here in Europe. Now, when we look at stolen firearms and criminal hands, we have actually seen seizures of stolen firearms in different types of criminal milieus, in the drug trafficking world, in the world of armed robberies, outlaw motorcycle gangs. All across Europe, we've seen cases there. And this is, of course, important to keep in mind, is that these criminals want these firearms for instrumental use, to use as an offensive tool, but also as a defensive tool to protect themselves against competitors or against law enforcement officials. So this is clearly why firearms are being trafficked and also why firearms are being stolen. Another issue that plays a role is an issue of reputation. The better your firearm, the more reputation you can actually have in the criminal world as well. So it's not just about purely instrumental use. It's also about these issues of status that play a role. And what we have seen in the incidents that we have analyzed is that these firearms that have been stolen, but also components or ammunition, can end up in criminal hands in many various ways. For example, via middlemen, or they can end up on the criminal market. This is something that we tend to see more and more with the non-targeted thefts, where burglars just take a firearm that they find and then they just sell it to somebody else who can then pass it on. But we've also seen cases of direct transfers by perpetrators to criminal groups. We've seen cases of targeted thefts where the perpetrators of the theft actually want to use the firearm themselves, either for criminal activities or for other activities. And also we've seen cases where firearm thefts are taking place with the intent to subsequently smuggle these firearms across borders, for example, so to make a profit out of it. So all of these different ways have been observed, and we don't have time to go into all of the details of the cases, but I would like to invite you to read our report and see the cases there. What I would like to highlight is some of these cases that of gun violence that have not only led to criminal behavior or criminal activities, but also a very strong societal impact. And those are often the guns used, for example, in public shootings. Here we see a picture of a shooting in Germany in 2009 at a school where a young boy took one of the 15 pistols that his father, a sport shooter, owned. And this is clearly an example of the importance of safe storage, because 14 out of the 15 firearms of his father were kept in a safe, closely, clearly secured. But the father kept one pistol next to his bed for security reasons. And it was, of course, this pistol that was taken by his son to commit a public mass shooting in which 15 people killed and 11 others were injured. The father was later convicted for involuntary manslaughter, by the way, and for negligence causing bodily harm. and received a suspended prison sentence of 18 months. So this is one of the examples where you can see how perpetrators take the weapons from, for example, a family member. This is a shooting that took place here in Belgium 10 years ago at the Christmas market in December 2011, where a man used an FN-style FAL rifle, automatic rifle, but also was in possession of a Smith & Wesson revolver, and he started shooting at the Christmas market, killing 5 people and injuring more than 120 others, and then committed suicide with the revolver. What we know now as well is that, for example, the revolver was obtained in the criminal world. Why? Because it was actually stolen from an arms dealer a few years before that. And some of the other weapons that were stolen from the same arms dealer were found in the house of an armed robber. So we know that there was definitely a connection to the world of robberies, and that therefore the perpetrator who had a criminal record, who was very active also, for example, in drug trafficking, used the gun through the criminal connections. We've also seen terrorist shootings where perpetrators use their criminal connections to get guns that were actually stolen. This is a picture from 2012 Toulouse-Montauban shooting, where the perpetrator used a Colt pistol, which was stolen from a sport shooter a few months earlier. And other weapons that were also stolen from the sport shooter were later recovered in the drug trafficking world in that same region in France. We've also seen terrorists, of course, stealing weapons themselves. I think one of the most notorious examples here in Europe is ETA, who were known to actually steal firearms directly from the stockpiles of police and arms dealers. But we've also seen other ways in which terrorists are able to acquire law enforcement or military stockpiles. For example, here in Copenhagen in 2015, where the perpetrator of the shooting on the cultural center and later the synagogue was armed with an M95 rifle, but also 2 pistols. And we know from police investigation later on that the rifle was actually stolen by members of a youth gang from the Home Guard, sort of a private militia within the Danish security system. And we also know that these members of the youth gang targeted this Home Guard specifically for this type of weapon. So these are just a few illustrations of the different types of dynamics that we have seen, which can also lead to different types of gun violence. As I said earlier, it's difficult for us to give you the clear answers to the questions on scope of gun violence with stolen firearms, because our study didn't focus on that specifically. But we will have more research coming soon, which will also deal with this question. And I'm referring to Project Target, which is a follow-up project that we are currently coordinating, where we are analyzing gun violence in 34 European countries, including in-depth analysis of a number of European countries, where we would like to know what the characteristics are of the firearms used in gun violence in Europe. We can see different types of firearms used for different types of gun violence, what the legal status was of the firearms, but also what the sources and supply chains were for these firearms before they ended up in the hands of perpetrators of gun violence. And as you can imagine, we will also focus on stolen firearms. This is just this is a research which is ongoing. We are working on it very intensively, and we will normally be publishing our reports and have an interesting conference to discuss all of these findings in November 2021. So it'd be great to see you guys there as well. With that, I would like to end my presentation and see if there are more questions in Q&A that popped up. In the meantime, maybe the speakers, Ian, and maybe you can actually turn on your screen as well, then we can see you. Ian, I don't know if you can hear me, but we also have a question specifically for you.
Yes, I can hear you, Nils. I've tried to start my video, but it says that you've blocked it, so it can't be shown. So yep. I've tried to, so I do apologise.
No problem. The question for you was whether or not in the UK the information on license holders, if that's a confidential question or that's a confidentiality or not, because there's also some suspicion in the Netherlands that sometimes people are targeted based on this type of information. So I don't know if you want to answer that question.
Yes, the database, the National Firearms Licensing Management System database, is for sort of law enforcement eyes only and cannot be accessed by the public. However, as sort of the rules are that if somebody was to go and purchase ammunition or a firearm from a registered firearms dealer, then obviously they have to show their certificate. So the registered firearms dealers would know who license holders are. But that database I was talking about, that is not accessible generally by the members of the public.
Okay, another question that popped up, which I think we can ask you as well, Ian. Is there any common issue or trends in terms of legislation loopholes related to firearms thefts? Given that you have such a vast experience also leading the FA group, European Firearms Experts, maybe you have some suggestions there.
Well, the licensing laws are quite stringent, certainly in the UK, and I don't know in many other countries. And certainly there are laws in place and offers as guidance for people how they can store their firearms, like I said in my presentation, securely. So the laws are there to do it, but unfortunately, if someone is determined to steal your weapon, if they know you possess one, then we know that they break into people's houses, they rip the gun cabinets off the wall. It's very difficult to legislate for things like that, if I'm totally honest with you. There are stringent rules and advice and guidance in place. It's just ensuring that people adhere to them. But no, I don't think there are any specific loopholes around the possession of them. It's just ensuring that license holders do adhere to them, don't become complacent, don't advertise the fact that they possess firearms, and to make them less of a victim.
Thank you for that. I think we're already going over time, so I would like to slowly end this webinar. I just wanted to mention that we also identified several good practices and several problems in legislation during our study as well, and you can find the results in our publication, which will be available today on our website. All of the participants will also get an email with the link to the report and the site where you can also watch the recording of this webinar. My colleagues of the Flemish Peace Institute just put the link to the report in the chat, so it is available, and I would love to hear more from you guys. This is the second Project Divert seminar that we have been working on, we've organized. I would like to thank all of the participants for their many questions. They're a bit more than we could answer. That's always good to see such great interest. I would also like to thank the speakers for their very insightful contributions. I think the fact that we received so many questions is a clear sign that there is definitely an interest and an appreciation for the speakers. And as I mentioned earlier today, there will be one more Project Divert seminar next month. On the 23rd of June, we will be presenting our findings on firearms fraud. So it would be great to see all of you there. You can easily register through our website, FlemishPeaceInstitute.eu, and then you can find all of the information on today's webinar, but also on next month's webinar there. With that, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and hope to see you again soon in real life instead of digitally. Let's hope that's possible soon. Thank you all, and bye-bye.